Welcome to Theology Thursday, a weekly podcast dedicated to cultivating theological conversation amongst millennials. I am your host, Ryan Mock.
And I am co-host Connor Grubbs. And just to give everybody a quick update on where things are with the podcast right now, we're currently available on Podbean, where you can download the episode. You can download the MP3 to your phone, your laptop, whatever. And you can also listen on the website. You can get the Podbean app, which allows you to listen to all the podcasts that they have to offer. And soon we will be available on iTunes and Spotify. But that takes a couple episodes being out before that actually happens. But we do, we have gone through the application process and we do qualify. So it'll be available on there soon.
Sweet.
Which is exciting because those are two major platforms for podcast listening. And we have a website and some other stuff coming soon as well. So just keep in touch. We are on Twitter as Theology T Pod. And we're also on Instagram at Theology Thursday. Through both of those places or by emailing us at theologythursdaypodcast@gmail.com, you could be featured on the show by sending a question, and we will answer it and talk about it on an episode. We want it to be interactive, so we would love that. And I look forward to that.
So Connor, we have a special guest with us today. We are not in our usual setting of my dad's garage. We are actually at this person's house. So introduce our special guest for us.
Special's a strong word, but we have my brother Jonny Grubbs, who is a youth pastor at Church by the Sea, an interdenominational church.
Yay!
I can see him cringing as you said that.
No, I love Church by the Sea. I really do. It's a great church, and the youth group's so, but the church itself is phenomenal.
Wow.
I'm just teasing. No,
you just trashed his youth group. What the heck?
So I'm just kidding. Johnny's doing a great job. He's a great guy.
We support you, Johnny.
And I don't say that just because he's my brother. Sincerely, he's also my friend. And Johnny, tell us a little bit about yourself and about kind of what God has called you to, what you're passionate about.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot like what you said. Youth ministry is one of the things I'm super passionate about, but I'm not just a youth pastor. I'm also a husband and soon to be first-time father. So I'm really excited about that. So my first disciples will always be my family. But after that, I love my church and I love my students, and I want to reach them and help them grow in their spiritual formation journeys. So.
Very cool. So we're here today with Johnny because he wanted to talk with us about some things. And the official topic, which Johnny's going to have to explain himself with this wording because I'm not entirely sure what this means, but the official topic for today is the unquantifiable spiritual aspects of ministry. So Johnny, what does that mean?
Yeah, so I just discovered recently in completing my first 2 years of college, I had to take a lot of required classes on leadership and about basically goal setting, and all that stuff was super pragmatic and super even exciting. And as I came into my third year as a full-time pastor, I was like, okay, I want to formulate my strategy for ministry and create these quantifiable goals, because that's what I was learning. But the more and more I looked at Scripture, the more and more I realized that that's not really it's not really a thing. That the church, I think, in the West is focused on numbers and things like that, whereas Jesus was focused on life change. And you can watch that take place, but there's an aspect of everyone's spiritual journey that you can't put on a pie chart. You can't make that something that makes sense on paper. So for me, it was that comparison between the pragmatic side of ministry and what does Jesus say ministry is.
So I'm pretty sure you read a book. You did not write a book.
No,
usually
I did not write a book.
When people interview people on podcasts, it's because they wrote a book. But you read a book called Immeasurable. Reflections on the Soul of Ministry in the Age of Church Incorporated.
Yes, by Skye Jehtani. I highly recommend the book.
So I feel like this has influenced your thinking on this topic.
It has. You know, it's interesting because I started to think about the emphasis of my youth ministry and where it would be before I read this book. And so I started to have thoughts similar to what are prescribed in the book before I read it. But the book helped, I think, articulate some things that God was already showing me. And it's by a fairly obscure author. So it's worth getting his name out there and letting people read it. But yeah, he basically kind of walks people through what is the purpose of the church in the Bible, and what is the purpose or the perceived purpose of the church in the West today, particularly the United States.
So I think one thing that kind of reflects how the West views ministry and views the church's success, I guess, is what we're talking about here, is there's been a few church planting tools, different computer-based softwares and things like that help track numbers as through social media, through different things with your church, and it refers to the people that the church is being promoted to through social media, email, whatever, as prospects. Now, this is a church software, right? This is like something that ministries are using, and it's referring to potential future members of the church as prospects. Now, I think that word right there alone says a lot, that ministries have this idea of what can the community do for us? What can we get out of the community, right? As far as maybe membership or tithes or this or that. The question really should be, what can the church do for the community, expecting nothing in return? So it's interesting that you talk about that, because, I mean, just recently I've seen a few different tools and maybe say resources that just the wording kind of used for it does kind of reflect our view on a church's success.
Well, the truth is we live in a consumer society, and that ends up sort of seeping into the way that we do church. And one of the examples that Skye Jehtani gives in the book is he sits down with a family at a coffee shop that previously attended his church, and he realized that they had left, and he was talking to them and seeing how they were doing. And they said they had gone to a different church because their grandkids liked the music and because it just seemed to fit them, kind of thinking of a consumer. It's kind of the way that, one latte might suit another person, right? And they were going to go to that church, and maybe they would come back when their grandkids got older or when they didn't like the church anymore. And Skye Jehtani said, well, I hope you don't come back. And, and at first they were kind of like, well, you didn't like us. And he's like, no, I love you. And of course I wish you were at the church. But what I want you to do is pick a flock and stay faithful to that flock.
Right.
And remain there and sow seeds there and produce fruit there, rather than just consuming, rather than taking it in. I want you to stay somewhere and give yourself away. So.
Right. Yeah, we see a lot of this idea of church shopping in America. Like, you're going to the supermarket and you're trying to pick out fruit or something. And you're like, oh, no, this doesn't really fit us. And I don't know. This is probably everybody's experience. You've probably heard people talk about, no, I don't really care for the music, or the youth program is so-so. I don't like the youth pastor, or the color of the carpet is ugly. Silly stuff like that. I mean, some people have made actual real concerns, like we don't align theologically with them,
right,
which I understand that, or they're not preaching the gospel
right,
on a regular basis, they're not teaching the Bible, and those are real concerns. But I don't know, you hear a lot of concerns that are just outright silly, and that's a reflection of the consumerism attitude in Americans.
Right.
So yeah, and so there's another thing I was talking about. The church looking at the community as far as what can we get out of the community. It's definitely for us going into church, a lot of times we go in with this attitude of what am I getting out of the church rather than what am I giving to the church. So it goes both ways.
And I think too, so that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, it is important to think about some of those things. We were talking in a staff meeting just the other day about our parking lot, and Connor actually came as a guest worship leader, and he could not figure out our parking lot. He was struggling with that himself.
It is one of the most stressful experiences I've ever had. I'm not going to lie.
And so if we can solve issues like that, there's nothing wrong with that. And
absolutely, yeah.
One of the things we were discussing was that there might be a grumpy husband who's not saved, and the wife is recently saved and trying to get her husband to come to church. And just because there's not good signage, and just because there's not a good parking lot, that's the last straw for him, and he doesn't come back.
I mean, I almost didn't lead worship for you guys.
Right, exactly. And so we have to admit that there's room for catering, especially to lost people who are looking for quality. That's okay. It's just, I think it's more about the attitude of church goers, especially who are believers. Do we really want to find a church that suits ourselves and makes us feel comfortable? Or do we want to be part of a community that builds God's kingdom? Is I think the question.
Right. And the consumer church and that kind of the seeker-sensitive movement definitely does carry a negative connotation to it to a lot of people. And I think there is a point where that goes too far. But Paul even talks about in 1 Corinthians the idea of being conscious of what an unbeliever is seeing when they walk into the church.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And Jonny, said it, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like at our church, we have Launching a Legacy, which is our campaign to fix up the church. And like with the children's area, it was really cruddy before. Like I'm pretty sure it turned several families away from joining our church. And, that's a concern. It could also be a health issue, so you want to get that stuff taken care of. And so, yeah, I definitely don't see a problem with working to I don't know if catering to people's needs is the correct word or not, but, that kind of idea. So
Right, because there are definitely extremes. There are the people who are going to let mold grow in the infant's room because they're like, well, God will provide. We don't want to spend any money on it. And then there are the people who are like, hey, we need to make this church look like the Taj Mahal or like, a football stadium or something really cool, And both are extremes.
Yeah, I think that when we let stuff slide that we shouldn't let slide like mold in the infant's room, that makes us look bad, but it also makes Jesus look bad, I think, because for non-believers who do come in and see that, they're like, wow, these Christians, there's mold in the infant's room.
It's right. Our job to reflect Jesus,
right,
to non-believers,
and we're also just supposed to be good stewards with what we have, and letting mold grow in the infant's room is not being a good steward. But, or like the parking lot too. Like the parking lot at Seminole is really gravelly and stuff.
Well, it's gravelly, but at least you know where you're going to park and how you're going to get out. Ryan, I'll have to show you this afterwards.
Well, I kind of got a glimpse.
It's like you're getting in row for a NASCAR race.
Like which in some ways is an awesome feature.
Well, no, but what I was thinking is how do people, and we could take up the whole podcast talking about this, but how do people in the middle even get out? They have to wait for like 5 other cars to go, but what if those people are waiting for... Look, it doesn't matter, but it's not okay, and you need to fix it.
Well, and that's the thing. It's interesting that God has kind of been leading me on this journey at a time when we're starting to do things for the community that we're serving in terms of some of these pragmatic things that I'm actually a part of, and I enjoy being a part of. We're working on our website and things like that I think are important. But I think what I've discovered is we can never lose sight of, in all of our pragmatic endeavors, lose sight of what is the purpose of the church, as is clearly laid out in the Gospels and in Acts, which is to share the gospel and to make disciples of those that believe, and then to care for the poor and the sick. And that's what you see in Acts. And if that doesn't remain our main calling and our main goal, then we have to sort of take a few steps back and revisit, why are we doing church?
Boom. There you go. Johnny just summed all that up for us.
Yeah, so kind of the motivation behind it. So what are some standout concepts from the book that stand out to you?
That you read.
Hence the term standout concepts.
Yeah, I think, I mean, that obviously, the example that I already shared was pretty big. The fact that he turned around and said, well, I hope that you don't come back. It wasn't that I hope you don't come back, it's that I hope that you find a community where you can sow seeds. But I think some other things that stood out to me is that, he talked about the fact that in creating a business model for ministry, we're setting a lot of pastors up for failure, because in some ways we're mixing water and oil. We're trying to create this thing that says you have to do this incredible, amazing, big thing, which is what modern America says, industrial America says, and you have this thing in Scripture that says, that like what Paul said it in the epistles, to work quietly with your hands, to just do a simple endeavor, and to just invest slowly and carefully over the course of many years in the life of a flock. And those are two very different concepts. And I think he talks about the fact that many pastors fail because they're under a pressure that Jesus never applied to them, but rather the culture applied to them.
Okay, so you talked earlier about, or we talked about earlier about measuring a pastor's success, kind of, and this idea. Connor mentioned using software to analyze future prospects and stuff like that. So we kind of understand that measuring our success, or measuring a pastor's success from an earthly standpoint, is not effective, and it's not biblical. What is an effective way to measure a pastor's success?
Faithfulness.
Explain.
Faithfulness. Yeah, I think it's a pastor's willingness to stay and to continue to sow, regardless of some of the things that may kind of be spinning around him. I don't know if I can go much further than that.
So what if a pastor is being faithful and their church is slowly dwindling with people? People are leaving the church.
I think that's where this quality comes in. It's you just continue to be faithful regardless. I think, to specifically answer your question, almost gets off on a whole new topic of how to manage a church. I as a pastor, if I were shepherding a flock and I was at the helm and people were leaving my church, I think I would ask questions of other people of how do we attract the families that are in our community, and how do we handle this pragmatic side. But it wouldn't stop me from continuing to make the hospital visits and do the funerals and the weddings and the things that people don't often see, but is vital to the work of a pastor.
Well, and on the topic of not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, I think there's a few things that we should recognize when we say this, because I like whatever topic we talk about. Even last week we were talking about Christian movies. It's important not to go to extremes. So I think we should recognize that, okay, yeah, you don't want to run your church like a business, but there are certain business practices that are going to be good for any pastor to know. One, just legally speaking, of owning a building and finances and stuff like that. If you don't want to go bankrupt and you don't want to go to jail, there are certain things business-wise. There's certain things business-wise you just have to know. So but it's that balance of learning that without depending on that. And then I also think it's important to know. I was talking about analyzing, potential future members of your congregation and stuff like that. It's good to go out there and promote your church, and it's also good. I was talking about, going out and seeing, what can the community do for us? No, the attitude of this church should be, what can we do for the community? But also, you do want to encourage your congregation as a shepherd. You want to encourage your congregation to contribute something, to not just be pew potatoes. They should be contributing to the church, but it's just about the attitude behind it, I think, ultimately.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with you.
I agree with you also.
Well, thank you. I'm glad we all agree about
a
something.
Triangle of agreement.
That's fantastic. So, what would you say, if anything, out of the seeker-sensitive movement is valuable?
Oh, I think actually there are a number of things that are valuable, and I think to preface it with what you just said is if you approach any aspect of the seeker-sensitive movement with the right attitude, I think it can be very valuable. For example, I remember one time I was working with a church that polled people about the church and what they would like to see. Now, you don't want to take all of that back and then just feed it back to the community, because it's about what they need spiritually, not just about what they want.
Right.
But by doing that, you can get to know your community. And Paul was excellent at preaching to the culture and about creating a church that fit well within its culture. So, like, I'm here on the beach, and we're trying to get to know how does a beach person think. There's sort of this laid back mentality here. We have a lot of people who are coming in and out that are tourists, and like right now our church doubles, and so getting to know where people are from. We have a number of different demographics represented at our church, including a lot of Canadians this time of the year that we don't have the next time of the year.
God bless you for ministering to the Canadians. I'm just kidding. I hope I didn't offend any Canadian listeners. We love you.
I think you just lost your entire Canadian constituency. But
well, we only have 9 downloads so far. So the odds that any of them are Canadians. Wow.
So yeah, I think that's one aspect of the seeker movement, is figuring out what your community likes, what they like to do. Would be good. So like doing more stuff on the beach in our case would be one example. And then facilities. We just started having coffee before church, and Pastor actually recently said this on Sunday. He said, if we let you guys have coffee in the sanctuary, you're probably going to spill it. And we have a carpet cleaner. He was like, I want us to be good stewards, but I also don't want us to not live our life as a church community. And that was very welcome, especially among the contemporary audience.
I'm sure.
To bring their
crazy
coffee.
Interdenominational people.
Yeah, they don't want coffee in our service.
No, I want to be careful. I do love Church by the Sea. I honestly love the story of these pastors from different denominations coming together to have an outreach to fishermen. That's awesome.
Yeah.
But that's a different topic. That's a topic for another day.
Did you see any flaws with the book's logic, or you talk about all the things you agree with, or anything you disagree with?
There's nothing per se that I disagree with. There are things I think that the book, it's not so much what the book said, it's what the book didn't say. Towards the end, Skye Jehtani, I don't want to misquote him, but more or less he describes the role of the pastor as a rehabilitator. He's trying to bring people back to themselves, and it gets a little new agey, which is a little bit weird, because I know Skye Jehtani believes the gospel. He just decided not to include it in this book, so that was a little disappointing. So I would definitely salt it with the gospel if you're going to read it, but I think everything can be applicable to people of any denominational background.
Okay, so for people who are not pastors and people who have not read the book, if you could think of any ways, what are some practical ways we can escape this idea of consumerism, or kind of, I don't know, free ourselves from that?
Right. I think it's about changing our mindset as consumer when coming to church. When we come to church, we are servants. If anything, we're members of an army, right? So if we're believers within the church, we're actually part of a group that's trying to build God's kingdom in the area that we've been planted. And I think a lot of people just come in and warm the pews, And so I think that would be one way. You're not there to consume anything. You're there to grow so that you can sow and build God's kingdom.
Hey, Ryan, did you notice that rhymed? He
Grow
said
and
grow
sow.
so you can sow. It rhymed. That's pretty neat.
So that's what I think and I think that the book has a lot of lessons for churchgoers. It's geared towards pastors, but we're out of luck if our congregations don't get behind this idea that we love to serve you as our congregants, but you as congregants are an army that are to be deployed for the work of the gospel in our community. So, yeah, I think that would be one way for people who are not pastors to.
Yeah, I agree. Are you gonna say?
Go ahead.
Okay, I was just gonna say, I don't know, in our personal experience, I think serving other people is definitely, I don't know. I'm not thinking about myself. I'm not consuming for myself. I'm serving other people, and I just think that's like the most practical thing you could do right there. So yeah, absolutely.
So that's essential. So you add that to kind of the church leadership's attitude of what can we do for the community, but then also, rather than what can we get from our congregation, what can we get our congregation to do for Christ, right? It's as a church being faithful, not just the pastor, but as a church being faithful and obedient. So to kind of narrow your question, since this is kind of geared towards our age groups, kind of millennials, college students, young adults, what specifically can that generation do to guard against consumerism? Because in my mind, that he's getting a call.
Oh my
gosh!
It's really
wow, Johnny, no respect.
I muted it too, so you think it would.
Hey Ryan, remember, leave a note. We're not having him back on the podcast. Anyway, where was I? I don't even remember.
You're talking
what
about
can our generation do?
What can our generation do? Because I think that goes beyond just their involvement in church. I think that's a day-to-day thing. Because if we allow consumerism to control our lives and our attitudes outside of church and in other aspects of life, then that's going to pour over to how we approach church. Because it's just going to be our heart's attitude. And it's just going to be the way our mind is wired. So I think that starts with guarding against consumerism in general, as a whole, like with just stuff in general, because we tend to cling to stuff.
Right.
Yes.
Right, and I think our generation is in part like the worst about that.
Right.
We got to recognize the fact that none of that stuff is going to heaven with us.
Right.
You know, like what we do for other people, what we do for the kingdom, that's what's going to count. That's what's going to last. Now, we're still meant to enjoy life and enjoy each other's companies, but I think I've found that the best fellowship, the strongest friendships I have are the people that I've served alongside of.
I've served alongside Connor.
Yeah, but that's where a lot of those relationships start, really, within the church.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember just like when we were younger and serving together.
Yeah, like I didn't even know Ryan. We just started doing stuff together, and through the church, and that's what it should be like. So I definitely encourage, college students, young adults that are involved in the church, start by guarding against consumerism, guarding your heart against that in general, right? Like not just always chasing after the next big thing and, getting so caught up with stuff, and then hopefully that attitude also starts to pour over into how you approach church. And also, on top of that, it's kind of like with addiction and kind of behavior therapy and all this sort of stuff. You can't just quit a bad habit. You have to replace it with a good one. So rather than just, let's not be consumeristic anymore, spend your time and your energy on something else like serving, getting involved with the church and an aspect of service. So now that I've babbled about it enough, what's your guys' take on that? How can our generation guard against consumerism?
I think that you summed it up pretty well. As a side note, I just want to add, I don't know, in our church's personal experience, when our people serve, I think that we saw growth in our church. I don't know if there's like something scientific behind that, but I don't know, especially for our youth group. When our students were out serving, I mean, I remember when I was in 6th grade and our youth group was incredibly small, and I know you remember that too. And then we were involved in Good News Club and all that stuff, and our youth group grew. And I think that there's a correlation there with the service that we did and the growth of the youth group. So I don't know if there's a relation to that.
Well, Paul said it's better to give than to receive, and better has many meanings, and so better could refer to growth. I mean, everything's better when you give instead of just receive. So.
Yeah, so I think absolutely those things are connected, because at the end of the day, Jesus said, I will build my church. So like the church growth, if we're going to quantify success, we're talking about the unquantifiable spiritual aspects of ministry, we usually quantify success by church growth and like how big the church is. But Jesus said he had the church growth part covered. We don't have to worry about that part.
Right.
He's doing that. We just have to be faithful and obedient. And we've seen firsthand how when the church is faithful and obedient, Jesus will bring the people.
Yes.
It's interesting, and I don't know how much time we have, but it's important to note we can easily grow a church by the things that we learn. And I've sat in many meetings where I said, listen, I know the 10 things I need to do to have 40 kids through our door. And there was a time where the church had those kids. But the minute we started to peel away, different programs, different events, one event in particular got the kids into a theme park. And people have asked, are we bringing this event back? And I know that if I did, we might have 40 kids at this event, but half of those kids would be coming just because they get a discount to the theme park, and they just do not care about spiritual things, and that's not going to change because they came to this event.
Yeah.
And so the idea is we can grow things, we can make things big, but that doesn't mean that it's helping anybody or fulfilling the work that God's called us to at all. And so success is measured in salvation and spiritual growth, spiritual formation, and again, we can determine, okay, that person obviously is saved, but we don't necessarily know everything that's going on in their spiritual journey. I had a student who went to our youth retreat, and he learned a lot of things, but it was a few months later that his cousin died of a heroin overdose. And he later told me, he said, the things I learned at the retreat about being near to God, about spending time with God, helped me not lose it during an extremely difficult time.
Wow.
I can't put that on a pie chart.
Right.
I didn't know what was going on inside this student's heart, but God did. And there's this quote success story there, but it's not really. I think it would cheapen it to call it just a success story. It's actually this life-changing work that God's doing in someone's heart, and I think that's what I'm referring to when I threw this concept at you. It's this aspect of ministry that we can't fit into the frame of modern church Inc.
First of all, one, I see that as a challenge. I'm going to try and put that story you just told me on a pie chart. And second of all, well, look, because some of the resources and stuff I've been looking at recently, that churches and different ministries, there are entire organizations dedicated to just having resources for analytics and all this stuff for churches. And I don't know why I've been looking at all this stuff the past couple of weeks, but it's fascinating to me because you can just turn about anything into a pie chart and make it sound like professional stuff. But so much of this stuff is just fluff. It's useless. Anyway, I'm just going to start turning everything to pie charts because it's a lot of fun. But I think there is so much, and I've seen it firsthand, and there's so much I haven't seen of the ministry we do that we just don't get to see. And I have countless stories I could tell about, times I was doing ministry and I didn't think it was being effective, and years later I heard about how God had used it in a way I never would have even imagined. Mm-hmm. And so, and those stories have helped me realize, okay, this is just at one time that God let me see what the results and the fruits of the ministry were. Imagine all the stuff He hasn't shown me. Right? Because it might be years and years and years down the road that God finally uses it, but ultimately we're just here to, again, be faithful, be obedient, and let Him, plant the seeds and let Him do the rest. Which can be hard, but you look at Isaiah, and before his call in chapter 6, there's several decades of ministry he did where nobody was responding. Nothing was happening. And we don't spend much time on that because it was such a boring time of his life. He was trying to preach to people and nobody was listening, and his ministry wasn't growing. And then God, called him to do something bigger, right? Because he'd been faithful. Faithful in little, faithful in much. So these have all been great thoughts. Any closing thoughts from either of you before I wrap it up?
No.
Okay, good. I just wanted to make sure. I didn't want to cut anybody off. So correct me if I'm wrong, the sermons and the Sunday morning services of Church by the Sea are available.
They are, yeah. If you go to our website, churchbythesea.com, that is churchbythesea.com, you will go to a website that is very much under construction, but is a lot cleaner and a lot fresher than it's been. And there will be a watch page, and you can see the latest video, but you can also follow that link to the rest of our videos. Everything gets posted online. And the youth page is coming soon, and it'll have some of the teaching God's allowed me to kind of formulate. We'll have all our 2018 series up pretty soon.
Do you have pie charts in your website?
We do not. No.
All right, that's an issue.
So I'll say if you're local and you're and also talk to me. I can make some pie charts for you. But if you're local and you're looking for a church, Church by the Sea is on Madeira Beach, and it really is a phenomenal church. Just a great atmosphere on a Sunday morning. And if you want to watch some of their stuff online, Pastor Jeff is a great preacher. So I encourage you to check that out. And then,
you can also come to our church also.
You could come to Seminole First Baptist as well. That's up to you.
If you like us better than Johnny.
Yeah. No, Seminole First Baptist is fun. I'll tell you one thing we do not allow you to do is drink coffee in the sanctuary.
That's
so
true.
That might be a deal breaker for you. But our parking lot makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, you kind of have to weigh that out. Like,
we're working on it, though.
Our parking lot is dirtier, but at least you know
it's not a labyrinth.
Yeah, you know you'll be able to get out at the end. So you kind of got to think about the parking, the coffee, those important things. I think after listening to this podcast, you know that those should be the top two priorities.
Yeah,
we
got our priorities straight.
When looking for a church, is parking and coffee. So, also we'll include a link. It's down in the show notes if you want to get a copy of Skye Jehtani's book and check it out for yourself.
Not written by Jonny Grubbs.
Not written by
Jonny Grubbs.
But highly endorsed by me. I would love if every pastor read it.
It's got the Jonny Grubbs stamp of approval, which I know means probably nothing.
That's what matters.
Well, if that doesn't matter to you, it is also Christianity Today's Book of the Year. So
that doesn't matter to me. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
I just need a Jonny Grubbs stamp of approval.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah. Does this podcast now have a Jonny Grubbs stamp of approval?
Of course.
Only because he was on it.
Yeah. Now you guys have me on.
If he wasn't, he would.
No, I started listening to your first podcast.
But you just started. You didn't finish listening.
It was
to
late. I had to go to bed.
No.
My mom told me my dad fell asleep when he listened to our first podcast. So.
But she listened to the whole thing.
She did, which is impressive
because
she always falls asleep during movies. So shout out to my mom. Love you.
Yeah, by the way, we've gotten several people so far that have said they listened to the whole episode and that they were engaged the whole time. I just want to say thank you for the positive feedback we've gotten so far. And continue to give us feedback. Negative feedback is welcome as well.
Like criticism.
We'll take it all as a grain of salt, But
Connor would prefer criticism of me on this particular show.
Well, I mean, I already have plenty of it. I don't need any more.
Whoa.
I'm just kidding. Thank you for being on the show with us today, Johnny. I'm sure it won't be the last time. Probably will.
I already wrote it down.
But that being said, Theology Thursday podcast at gmail.com, Twitter handle @TheologyTpod. Get in touch with us. Ask us some questions. Give us some feedback.
If you can make a pie chart, let us know.
Make us some pie charts to get those 9 downloads. Hopefully, you figure out how many of them are from Canada, and to figure out what kind of parking people prefer at church. All that being said, I think it's time to say goodnight. Johnny's got his little Mickey stuffed animal right next to him, and I think he's ready for bed.
I wish this was on video so that there could be more explanation. It's not just a little Mickey stuffed animal. Never mind.
But also see the shelf of dolls behind Johnny.
See, I wasn't going to include that, but you did. So,
my wife and I share an office.
Well, keep trying to defend yourself.
She's allowing you to have your dolls in the office.
So that was really nice of her. So, we'll hear from you next week on Theology Thursday.